Turn with me to Joshua chapter 9. Joshua chapter 9 is the beginning of the second part of the book of Joshua. The entry narrative, which we've already seen through the first 8 chapters, ends. The people come into the land, they cross over the Jordan. Jericho represents the judgment of God coming into the land, the native peoples now being announced to them that their judgment is come, and then Ai represents God's promise now coming in for the people to settle the land. This is the first time that they're able to plunder the people, and so now it's theirs. They are able to take it, and so the first 8 chapters are the entry narrative, and then in chapters 9 through 11, we recount the beginnings of the official conquest of the land. The people moving city by city through this territory, through this land, destroying the people and occupying the conquered territory. So we're moving into part 2 of this book this morning, where the people move out to conquer the land, taking for themselves that which God had promised them 600 years earlier is now theirs to take. So we start this section, part 2, with the immediate response of the native peoples. If you look at chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, you see that response. The word of the destruction of Jericho and Ai spreads throughout the territory. I can imagine that would have gone fairly quickly. The kings of the cities now would understand 3 things that would be true. Number 1, a massive new people has descended upon Canaan, and they possess great military strength. The author describes, you will notice in these 2 verses, the area that includes Canaan. Everything in question is what he says is beyond the Jordan, meaning to the west of the river that they have just crossed, all the way to the Great Sea. So from the Jordan to the Mediterranean, and then from the hill country where they are currently located, which is in the central part of the territory, they're in a place called Shechem, as we looked at last week, north to the border of Lebanon. Now, Lebanon is not a nation at that time, just an area, and so north to Lebanon in the north, from the central area where they're positioned. So all of a great territory from a line at the top of the Dead Sea across to the Mediterranean, up the side of the Mediterranean to the border of Lebanon, across and down through the Sea of Galilee, south through the Jordan. All of that territory there is what Joshua refers to. So a massive new people has now come into this territory. That would be the first thing these kings would note. But a second thing is that this people is led by a God that has unrivaled powers to their own. Now, I'm using the word God with a lowercase g here because they do not know who Yahweh is. Okay? We know who Yahweh is, but they do not know who this God of the Israelites is. All they know is of him. They just don't know who he is. They have no direct contact with him. Remember, Yahweh has not had any direct understanding and revelation to them. So their understanding of Yahweh is primitive at best. But because they're a superstitious pagan people living in that times, they will understand the idea of deity. Understand the idea of deity, as all generations do. They might have a pagan and superstitious way of understanding deity, but they do understand that there is a God at work behind this people. So a massive new people with a God behind them, and it would appear that this people is bent on sacking every city in the land and taking possession of everything. So the three main things all these kings understand is a massive new people being led by a deity has come to destroy everything. That's what they've come to realize. I would put it like this. Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, has not kept his plan secret. Okay? The God of the Israelites has made it very clear what he intends to do in this land. As I said earlier, Jericho and Ai are announcements. Okay? They are an announcement to the kings of this land that indeed God has shown up in a people. And so they know this. It's not likely that that God has hidden this. In fact, I think it's highly likely that God has purposed for these kings to know that he has come through his people into this territory. He has purposed this. So, how did the native kings respond? Well, according to verse 1, it says, verse 2, I'm sorry, they gathered together as one to fight against Joshua and Israel. They make an alliance. They form an alliance together. It says they come together as one. They combine their forces. They realize that no one city can stand before the military power of these Israelites. That's already been demonstrated in Jericho and Ai. They recognize that. And so they decide that the best thing to do would be to create an alliance of multiple cities working together, and maybe that can repel these invaders. They make a logical choice. Okay? They make a logical choice. The only option before them is a military one. There is no other option for them. They make a military alliance because they realize, well, what other choice have we got? What are we going to do? In other words, they don't appear to even consider an alternate course of action. They don't even consider an alternative course of action. Their reality is such they have no choice but to respond militarily against the invaders and their God. Now, I want you to hold that thought for a bit because it'll be important as we move along in the chapter. This is a people who make an alliance because they have no other alternative, at least none that they're willing to explore. Now, in verses 3 through 6, the Gibeonites respond. There's a response of the native kings, all listed here, but there's a response of a people called the Gibeonites. It says, when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they on their part acted with cunning and went and made ready provisions and took worn-out sacks for their donkeys and wineskins worn out and torn and mended with worn-out patched sandals on their feet and worn-out clothes. And all their provisions were dry and crumbling. Now, let's note who these people are. The Gibeonites are Hivite natives in central Canaan. Ethnically speaking, this group is Hivites. You notice verse 7, they're referred to as the Hivites. Okay, so they're Hivite people. It would appear, however, that they are a subset of the total Hivite people in the area. We know in verse 1 that the Hivites were a part of the alliance. Okay, so you have two different Hivite peoples being mentioned. You have the Hivites that join in the alliance in verse 1, but you have another group of Hivites here that are called the Gibeonites. That implies that the group we're talking about here in this paragraph are a splinter from the whole group. They're a subset of the larger group of Hivites. It says that they live in the city of Gibeon, but they also occupy the cities of Shephirah, Beeroth, and Kiriath Jearim, according to verse 17. Gibeon lies just a few miles to the west of the city of Bethel, which is just northwest of Jericho and Ai. Remember, we mentioned Bethel last week, that was one of the cities that sent their forces to help Ai when Israel came against him. So Gibeon is just a little bit down the road from Bethel. And like the list of verse 1, the Hivites were targeted for destruction. Like all of the other ites mentioned in the first two verses, these are people who are destined for destruction from the beginning. In fact, the Hivites are even mentioned back in Deuteronomy chapter 20 and verse 17, when God gives a list to Moses of the specific peoples in the land that are to be destroyed. The Hivites are mentioned in that list. And it would appear these Gibeonites figured, we're next on the list. The people of Israel had moved from Jericho, which they destroyed, to Ai, which they destroyed, and we are just down the road from them. They figured they're next in line. So these Gibeonites, it says in verse 4, on their part, concoct a plan to save themselves from certain destruction. It says also in verse 4, they acted with cunning. So they concocted a plan that they figured would attempt to fool the Israelites into thinking that they were actually travelers from a distant land. Okay, so they decided they would use a method where they would show up at the doorstep of the Israelites, pretending to be a people from a far off land. Now, I can't help but notice the irony here, and the irony is that Joshua used a deception in the previous chapter to take out the city of Ai, didn't he? So you could argue that turnabout is fair play. So what did they do in this cunning little plan? Number one, they made props. Okay, they made props. They put on worn-out clothing that looks like they had worn it on a long journey. They stocked themselves with dried-out provisions, which made it look like they had traveled a long way and that their food was, fresh when they left and stale by the time they arrived in this place. So they made props. Secondly, they actually entered into the very camp of the Israelites itself. It says that they came, verse 6, they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal. They actually walked right into the camp of the Israelites and went and found Joshua in that place. As though they were arriving from a distant land, they bravely entered right into enemy territory. It's all part of the plan. It's all part of the process, right? And then thirdly, and most importantly, they sought a covenant with the Israelites. They pretended to be emissaries from a distant king, seeking an alliance with the Israelites. You see that also in verses 9 to 11. We have come from a distant country. Your servants have come because of the name of the Lord your God. We heard a report of him and all that he did in Egypt, and all he did to the two kings who were beyond the Jordan. So our elders and all the inhabitants of our country said, take provisions and go meet them. We are your servants. Make a covenant with us. Okay, so their plan was to come pretending emissaries from a far-off king in the hope that they would make a covenant with the Israelites. The Gibeonites pretended to be something they were not. The Gibeonites pretended to be something that they were not in order to get the Israelites to make a promise not to kill them. Make a covenant with us. Once you make a covenant with us, then once you figure out the ruse, it's too late. You've already made a covenant. That's their plan. Now, I suspect that it's possible that the Gibeonites understood the covenantal nature of the Israelites. Think about the Israelite people. They exist by virtue of a covenant made by Yahweh that they would be the very people that God would give this land to, the covenant that he had made with Abraham centuries before, and that these people were covenantal by nature. They were in covenant relationship with their God, and they were in a covenant relationship in terms of getting this land. It's possible that the Gibeonites knew this, understood this, and decided maybe to take advantage of that reality. I'd go so far as to say that it's possible they knew the Israelites treated covenants as central to their existence. And so by coming into this place and saying, make a covenant with us, in essence what they're doing is they're appealing to the very essence of what it means to be an Israelite. We are a people who exist only because we are in covenant relationship with God, and so the Gibeonites come in and say, make a covenant with us, appealing to that very essence of what it means to be an Israelite. In fact, down in verses 9 to 11, which I just read, they readily admit their desire for a covenant flows from their understanding of the God of the Israelites. We have heard the report of your God and what he did. And so we've come to make a covenant with you. Just like he made a covenant with you, we want to make a covenant with you. They may have, in fact, been appealing in that way. And they seek his power because they know his power compels them to seek a covenant with his people. So it's possible that the Gibeonites are actually exploiting something out of the Israelites in this deception. Now, the deception itself, really, up until now, up until verse 7, the deception is simply planned, but now comes the reality of it in verses 7 to 14. The Israelites begin to question these people who have showed up in their camp. The leaders with Joshua are immediately suspicious. Notice verse 7. Perhaps you live among us. How can we make a covenant with you? Now, Israel had been specifically instructed not to make any covenant with the natives. You go back to Deuteronomy chapter 7, starting in verse 1 and following, you find that God had specifically said to Moses, do not make a covenant of any kind with the natives. Do not establish any promises with the natives. Why? Well, the reason is simple. I, the Lord your God, have predetermined these people to be destroyed. So don't make covenants with them. Don't make promises to these people, because they're under the indictment of my decree. So the question that the leaders ask is perfectly reasonable, isn't it? How can we be sure you aren't Canaanites? How can we be sure of that? And they respond this way. They say, well, we are your servants. We have come to serve you. The Gibeonites here appeal to the good nature of the Israelites. They appeal to the good nature of the Israelites. We've come to help you, right? You'll notice they deflect the answer to the question by simply moving into an appeal to the good nature of these leaders. We've come to help you, see. We've come from a far off place and we've come to help you. That certainly must mean something, right? But Joshua continues the questioning. Who are you? Where do you come from? Verses 8 to 13. In other words, be more specific. If you are not natives of Canaan, then where are you from? That would be the logical question that I would be likely to ask as the next question. How can I be sure that you're not from around here? Well, all right, so tell me where you are from. And again, their response is simply ambiguous. Well, we're from a distant country. We're from a distant land. We've come because of the name of the Lord. Again, the Gibeonites deflect from a direct answer, and this time their response is to appeal to the success of the Israelites under the power of God. We've heard of what your God has done, and that's amazing. We've heard of the power and the greatness of your God, and so we've come because we've heard of this, you see. Certainly that must mean something to you. So the Israelites are deceived. It says in verse 14, the men, that is the men of Israel, took some of their provisions, but did not ask counsel from the Lord. They examined the props and were fooled by them. They examined the props and were fooled by them. And it also says that the leaders did not seek counsel from the Lord. They were simply convinced by what they saw and heard. I would put it like this: they were easily duped. They were easily duped. They failed to investigate the matter thoroughly. You notice what it says in verse 16, that it only took 3 days to figure out that these people were Gibeonites, so it wouldn't have taken much effort to have really discovered who they are. But they don't. And they fail to seek the Lord's permission to make a covenant, blindly stumbling into the deception. Now, I suspect you're probably asking, why? How were they so easily duped? Well, in the way that all of us are easily duped into things. All you got to do is appeal to the right stuff. And sometimes appealing to the right stuff leads us away from what we really ought to do. The Gibeonites appealed to them as, well, we've come to be your servants. Hey, these guys might be useful. And we've heard about the greatness of your God and what he's able to do and what he's done through you. And aren't you a powerful people? And the leaders of the Israelites appear to pat themselves on the back, thinking to themselves, look how great we are. Come on, let's make a covenant with these guys. They seem good. They're easily duped. And in verse 15 it says that Joshua made a covenant with them. He promised to let them live, and the rest of the leaders joined him in the covenant, swearing to them the full protection of the Israelite people. Now let me just pause and insert something here. The hasty covenant made by Joshua with the Gibeonites as a result of their deception is an excellent reminder that we live not by lies. That we live not by lies. Now you may be thinking, I've heard that somewhere before. You remember a couple of weeks ago, I preached a sermon called The Proper Christology in the Church, and I mentioned in that sermon a book by Rod Dreher called Live Not by Lies. Now Dreher intended in his book to address Western culture. Everything in Western culture now is built upon lies. That fundamentally the entirety of our civilization and our culture is built upon lies. And his perspective in the book is that believers should not then accept these lies as the basis of living in such a culture. That we need to be a people who are discerning, to know the difference between what is a lie and what is the truth. The truth, of course, is a biblical concept. The culture is a lie. And so we need to be thinking in that particular way. Everything culturally, societally, politically, in the entertainment world, media, etc., we all need to be thinking, okay, what is true and what is false? And we need to be making the appropriate assessments of all of that sort of thing. Now, Dreher wants to live, of course, in the political world. As I argued, the book doesn't really speak much in the theological world or the spiritual world. But the truth, live not by lies, must also be true and central in our understanding of eternal spiritual matters as well. Let me give you an example that will help you understand what I'm saying. For 15 years, I have served as the pastor of the church, and there have been a number of times, more than I can count, of people who have come to the church looking for a handout, looking for money. It's a constant thing. It was more particular in Phillipsburg than it is here because Calvary sat on a major U.S. highway running east and west. And so transients would come to town and they would come to the house and they would knock on the door and they would be invariably looking for a handout of some sort. And almost every one of them, I think it's universal. I simply cannot remember an example where it wasn't. That every single person who came to the door made the assertion that he or she was in fact a Christian. It was almost invariable. And it makes sense, right? You wouldn't show up at the door of a pastor without in some way attempting to appeal to him on the basis of that which probably would elicit some sort of compassion from him. And I think that the reason that they would do this, I think there were three reasons why they would immediately go to the fact that they were a Christian. And my wife will testify that this is true, that almost every time they come to the door and say, well, look, I'm a Christian and I'm just moving across country and I have a job waiting for me at some place along the road and so I just need to get there. And when I get there, then, and it was the same story all the time, every single time, which is, of course, what makes me suspicious because I'm naturally skeptical anyways. But the reality is that these people would invariably call themselves Christians, as I said, number one, to elicit compassion from me, but number two, to shield me from delving into their actual spiritual condition, you see. Because they would come and say, look, I'm a Christian. And so they wouldn't have to worry about me then sitting them down in the living room and saying, okay, let me share with you what the gospel is. Because they've already made the claim to be a Christian, so they believe that they can be shielded from any sort of diving investigation into their real existence. And then thirdly, in a twisted and strange sort of way, it actually makes them feel better about themselves. It actually makes them feel better about them. So to make a claim, which they have probably made 1,000 times, which they may now actually come to believe, and that sort of makes them feel better about themselves. I can feel better about the fact that I call myself a Christian, that I come and make a claim like this. And in a twisted sort of way, it actually makes them feel better about themselves. Now, I don't doubt that there were probably some of them who were, in fact, believers. Maybe immature, uneducated, but nonetheless there were probably some. But I suspect that the vast majority were not, based on fruits and evidences and so forth that I would see from their lives. Now, I give you that story because in reality, there are numerous people in the church today who are, in fact, living the lie. They're living the lie. You see, they have been told, or maybe I should put it this way, they have been lied to, that to be a Christian is simply to profess some sort of faith in Jesus and try to live like a good person. That's a lie. It's a lie. But they believed it. They believed it. And they believed that it's somehow advantageous to them to believe this lie. You see, it used to be in our culture that you needed to be a Christian in order to really thrive in this culture. It's not that case anymore. In fact, quite the opposite now. But there were many people, and there probably still are many, who considered it advantageous to believe that because at one point in their past they professed faith in Christ in some sort of way, and they go through life trying to live the best way that they can, and they sprinkle it with a little bit of religiosity every once in a while. They go to church once in a while. You know, they're kind of there, they're kind of not. But they believe that fundamental lie. And they believe that it is advantageous to them. In other words, to them, there is value in the delusion. There's value in the delusion. It makes them feel good about their spiritual condition. I mean, after all, if someone has told you that because you prayed a prayer, you're going to go to heaven when you die, that provides some sort of comfort, right, to you? But there's another reason why many think that it's advantageous to actually go around calling themselves a Christian. No one bugs them about it. You see, it's so much easier to be around other Christians if you claim to be one yourself, because then no one bugs you about it. No one looks at you and says, well, Sam over here claims to have and be a Christian, but his life doesn't show much faith in Christ. But because we have shallowed the gospel so much, such a person is now able to just walk around and nobody bugs them about that. They live the lie. This is a warning to us. To live not by lies. The consequences of such a thing are dire. You see, you can lie to your pastor. And most people think that pastors are gullible and believe these sorts of things. You can lie to your pastor. You can lie to your friends. You can lie to your family. You can lie to your parents. You can even lie to yourself. But you cannot lie to the judge of all the earth. Because he knows who you truly are. He knows where your heart is. He knows where your priorities are. He knows whether you're living by faith or just going through the motions. He knows the difference between the two. So personally, this is a warning. Do not live by the lie. And the same is true of the church, communally. And this is where it really goes hard. We as the church must be willing to ask the hard questions necessary in order to ferret out the lie. I know sometimes we're like, I don't want to do that. That's the point. That's why Sam is walking around thinking that because he prayed the prayer one time and goes to church every 6 months or so, that he is a Christian. Because nobody bugs him about it. But we're no longer living in such a time. Now it's a time for us to ferret out the lie. In fact, we should have been doing it all along. We must disciple everyone to a deeper commitment to Christ, to seek truth at the center of the life of everyone who claims to be a Christian. We are putting the soul of men and women into danger when we're not willing to ask the question, are you living the lie, or are you walking by faith? In other words, although the Gibeonites use a deception, it is the Israelites who are to blame. They had the responsibility to investigate thoroughly before making a covenant. It is their failure. You see, my friends, the father of lies desires that all men believe the lie. You understand that what the devil wants is for you to believe the lie. Because that's all he needs for you to do. It's just believe the lie. The church needs to carry out its mission to ferret out the lie so that no one is deceived concerning the truth of Christ. We have that responsibility. That is a hard responsibility. But we must not let the father of lies convince anyone to believe and live the lie. But the ruse is uncovered. Starting in verse 16, it says, within just 3 days, the actual identity of the Gibeonites is uncovered. Now, very next statement is that they set out to go to that place and reach their cities on the 3rd day, verse 17. So it seems likely that the progression is this, that the Israelites are marching on their way towards the city of Gibeon. They are probably on their way to those cities as the next cities to conquer when the delegation from Gibeon arrives. Okay, so the Gibeonites don't have to go very far, obviously, to reach to the Israelites because the Israelites are on their way to that particular place. So it is likely that their arrival at the cities reveals that the delegation is actually from Gibeon. Somehow it is made known. I think there's a squealer in the group. Somebody brags about this situation of who they really are. So the Israelite leaders who had made the covenant prevent the people from attacking them. Okay, you'll see it, verse 18. The people of Israel did not attack them because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. But then it says next that all the congregation murmured against the leaders. It would appear that the bulk of the Israelites are perfectly prepared for the next step in the process, which is to go and destroy the city. And they're on their way. Hey, we're going on to the next place. The next place is someplace called Gibeon, and we're going there, and everybody's ready, and everything is primed. And suddenly this Gibeonite delegation shows up, convinces the leader to make a covenant, and now the people, primed and ready to destroy the city, are told, nope, we're not going to do that. And they begin to murmur. By the way, that word murmur, whenever you see it, means to complain under your breath. Okay? It's another way of saying to talk about the pastor when you're not with him. Murmuring. Okay? As I said, there may have been a sense of anticipation amongst the Israelites, but the sense of anticipation may have been because, hey, we get to plunder another city. We get to go to Gibeon and take their stuff. So the murmuring may partly be because they thought they were going to be able to grab some more stuff. But there's a possible second reason, and that they may have realized as well that this covenant was a violation of the express command where God, and may have been concerned about how God was going to react when he found out that someone had made a covenant against his express wishes. Hearkening back to the days of Achan earlier in this book, maybe their murmur was, oh, we are so in trouble. Don't know, doesn't say. So, starting in verse 22 then, Joshua comes with the results of this deception. He confronts the Gibeonite delegation with the obvious question, why did you deceive us? I would ask that question, wouldn't you? Hey, we just found out you're Gibeonites. Whoa, 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 whoa. Why did you lie to us? And I think the Gibeonites' response is perfectly reasonable and acceptable. Exactly what I would have said. Because I want to live? Because I knew what you were going to do? Because we knew what we were in line for? We deceived you because we knew what your God had ordered for us through Moses? So they turn to Joshua and they say, whatever seems good and right in your sight to do to us, do it. Now, you will notice that what they're saying is, okay, you can't kill us because you made a promise and a covenant not to do that. But whatever else you want to do, that's perfectly fine. We will accept whatever other punishment you have prescribed over us. Whatever else you've decided. So Joshua condemns them to be woodcutters and water bearers for the people of Israel. That they were to become slaves of the people. Verse 23, you are cursed, and some of you shall never be anything but servants, cutters of wood and drawers of water for the house of my God. You are cursed to be a slave of the people of Israel. Now, I'm going to pause right there. That's the bulk of the story. And ask a question. You know me. I spend a lot of time in my office asking questions of the text. Here's the beaut of the day. Is this really a curse over the Gibeonites? Or is it actually a blessing from God? Because he purposed for the Gibeonites to be a remnant in Canaan, in the fashion of Rahab. Now, you know how I'm going to answer that question, right? No, this is not a curse over the Gibeonites. Oh, I know Joshua uses the word a curse, but bear with me. I am convinced from this story that God has purpose for this ragtag group of Hivites that come from these cities to actually be a remnant of those saved in Canaan. That he purposed it. In other words, God had actually ordained for these Gibeonites to be saved out of Canaan. Although they used a ruse to get out from under their destruction, the ruse itself was used by God as a means for their salvation. Now, to prove my point, let me ask you some questions. Number one, if the Israelites had in fact gone to the Lord and asked his counsel when the Gibeonites showed up, what would God have said? Now, what's our automatic assumption in that question? Our automatic assumption is, hey, these are Gibeonites. Is God speaking here? These are Gibeonites. They've come and made a ruse over you, so kill them, and kill them all, and kill them now. But that's an assumption on our part, isn't it? That's a complete assumption on our part. We are making that assumption because we know how the story works and we know all the details of the story. Our automatic assumption is that because God has ordained for the Hivites to be destroyed, that this little subset of the Hivites also needs to be destroyed. So we just automatically put words in God's mouth. But are you sure that that's how God would have responded? Is it true that we can know that for certain? That in fact God would have said, kill them? In fact, we cannot, can we? But let me ask you a follow-up question to that. And this is the one that secures the answer I just gave you. You will notice in Joshua chapter 9, God never speaks. You see it? He never says a word anywhere in this chapter. And yet, isn't it fascinating, as I pointed out last week, that in every single incident in this book, up until now, before the people of Israel do something, he comes and speaks to Joshua every single time, with one exception. And this is why I think it's so true, with one exception, and that exception is when Joshua sends spies into Jericho and Rahab lies to save the spies. In every other situation, in all of the other chapters, God shows up and says something to Joshua. In the last chapter, we saw him say to Joshua, hold your spear out, pointed at Ai as a signal. It was God that told him to do that. God speaks. Why doesn't God speak in this chapter? If God knows that these Gibeonites standing in front of the Israelites with this deception, using their props and their little story to try to convince the Israelites that they're actually from a distant land, why doesn't God show up and say to Joshua, that's a ruse, that's a lie? He doesn't, does he? He never says a word. He allows the incident to simply pass by. Is it possible that the silence of the Lord tells us much here? But let me point out a third thing, and this is very important to remember. Why is the response of these Gibeonites and those from the city, this little subset of Hivites, why is it so different from all the rest of the response of the kings of Canaan? Remember at the first two verses, I had you look at the fact that all the other kings make an alliance, don't they? They decide, well, the only choice we have is to gather together militarily and try to repel these Israelites from coming. But these Gibeonites have a completely different response. They have a completely different response. And it reminds me of a very important principle. And it goes like this. The reprobate heart, the heart that stands in rebellion to God, how does that heart respond when the announcement of judgment comes to it? How does the reprobate heart respond? According to Romans chapter 1, it responds with greater rebellion. We saw this when we looked at Romans 1 a couple weeks ago, remember? They refuse to worship God. They want to worship the creature rather than the Creator. And so God turns them over. And when He turns them over, what do? They sink into even more depravity. And so God removes His hand again. And what do? They sink into even more depravity. The reprobate heart responds to the announcement of judgment by becoming more rebellious. Not less. More rebellious. The kings of Canaan hear of the judgment of God coming. How do they respond? They decide to rebel even more. We will fight these Israelites and we will take their God out. That's what they're saying. We'll destroy these Israelites and we'll destroy their God. How does the reprobate heart respond to the announcement of judgment in even greater rebellion? How does the elect heart respond when judgment is announced? Very differently, doesn't it? Very differently. The elect heart responds to the announcement of judgment by pleading for mercy. That's what the elect heart does. The elect heart hears that there is judgment to come. The elect heart looks and sees that it is a sinner, and it throws itself upon the mercy of the living God, which is exactly what the Gibeonites were doing. They came looking for mercy. If you're looking for something to etch on my tombstone, here it is. What human beings need most from God is mercy. We don't need bigger bank accounts and better cars and more health. What we need is mercy. What we deserve from our God is to be utterly destroyed. What we deserve from our God is to be cast away from Him forever, to experience His wrath and His anger against sin and rebellion for eternity. That's what we deserve. What we need is mercy. What we need is for God to not do to us what we rightly deserve. It reminds me of a parable that Jesus told about two men who came into the temple to pray. Luke chapter 18, verses 9 to 14. A Pharisee comes in, I'm paraphrasing now. Lord, I thank you that I'm not like other men. I tithe. I'm here at the synagogue and the temple at a regular basis. You know, I'm a good man. People look to me as a leader in the community. I know I'm adding to the story, but you get the point, right? I'm a great guy. I don't need anything from you because I've got everything I need. I'm a good man. I got everything that I need. But Jesus says in the parable that there was a tax collector who also came, and in verse 13 it says, "But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner." And Jesus even went so far at the end of that parable to say, and it was that man, the tax collector, who walked away justified. The Gibeonites come into the camp of the Israelites and they say, it is better for us to be slaves of the Israelites than to die by the sword of the Israelites. It's better for us to be a slave in Israel than it is to die by the sword. You see, my friends, listen. The reprobate heart responds with rebellion. The elect heart responds for mercy. And these Gibeonites responded like elect men do. And it's better for us to be assigned a very lowly place in heaven than to spend an eternity perishing in hell. But that's not enough to make my case that I'm convinced that these people were, in fact, ordained by God to be saved. There's one more question I would ask. Where are the Gibeonites assigned to work as woodcutters and water bearers? This is the part of the story that most people don't notice. Where are they assigned to work? It says that they are to work in a place. It says they are to work first up in verse 23 for the house of my God. But down in verse 27 it says, "But Joshua made them that day cutters of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord to this day in the place that he should choose." Now I don't want you to miss that verse. The place that he should choose, meaning where would the altar of God be established? Or more specifically, where would the tabernacle be set up as a permanent place in Canaan? Because it will be. And we know, according to 1 Samuel 4:3, we know according to Joshua 18:1, that the tabernacle will be set up at a place called Shiloh. Doesn't say that here, but it will eventually say that in the 18th chapter of this book. God is going to eventually instruct the Israelites to set up the tabernacle permanently at Shiloh. So they don't have to drag it around the wilderness, taking it down and setting it up. Well, not the wilderness, but all around Canaan. There has to be a central place for it, so they put it at Shiloh. And it stays there until the days of David. 1 Samuel 4:3, when David takes the ark and brings it into the city of Jerusalem, which he finally overcomes and makes the new capital of Israel. Okay, so where's the place? The place is wherever the tabernacle is being set up. The Gibeonites are to serve the altar of the Lord, or at the house of my God. Verse 23. What is the house of my God? The tabernacle. It's the place where worship happens. In other words, the curse, quote unquote, of the Gibeonites is that they are to serve the priests and the Levites. Yeah, they're going to do the menial tasks, going cutting the wood for the fires on the altar and going and getting the water that will be needed for the sacrifices and so forth. Yeah, they're going to have that menial task of doing that. They're going to serve the Levites in this menial task, but they're going to do it under a people and in a place of great honor. They're going to do it in a place of great honor. You might say Joshua balances the punishment over them for their ruse within the realization that God has in fact set them aside to be saved. In much the same way that God set aside a woman who lied through her teeth in order to save some spies, and God honored that to bring her into a place where she would be included amongst the people of Israel. He's doing the same thing here. He gives them a place of honor. So you see, I'm convinced that these Gibeonites are actually coming because God has ordained them to do so. They are a remnant that God has set aside. Yes, they used a ruse, but so did Rahab. And God used the ruse as a means to bring this little remnant out of Canaan. Now, your response to that would be, well, I thought that God said kill them all. And God has every right to say that, does he not? He has the right to say who lives and who dies. The Lord gives life, the Lord takes life, blessed be the name of the Lord. It's up to him to decide who lives and who dies. By the way, that would be a good lesson for us to remember today. But the bottom line is that God may have made that order, but God is also the right to make whatever exceptions to it he wants. And I think he's made an exception here. So let me put this chapter to you like this. The mission of the church is to announce the judgment of God coming upon sin. You don't see that on a whole lot of church marquees, do you? But the mission of the church is to announce there is a day of judgment coming. But not only do we announce that there is judgment coming, but we are to proclaim a message into the world that leads a people that God has set aside to himself. We call them the elect. They respond, and we lead them to the mercy of God found in the cross. You see, we are to ferret out the lie of the Pharisee. We're to ferret out the lie of the Pharisee. The Pharisee stood before God and lied. He lied to himself. He tried to lie to God. Look at me. Look how wonderful I am. I deserve a place in your kingdom because I am a great man. And I have done wonderful things. I've jumped through all the religious hoops that you can jump through. I've done it. But that's a lie. Because the Lord says, that's not what gives you mercy. We must ferret out that lie. We must help our fellow followers of Christ, believers, to not live that lie, but rather to be a people who seek the mercy of God. We must seek out God's mercy and come like the tax collector to the Lord, seeking the mercy of God in humble submission and obedience to Christ. There is no other message more important to be proclaimed in the church. We are sinners, and we need mercy from the Lord. If we belong to the people of God, our hearts will respond to that need for mercy. We will not respond as the reprobate do. We'll respond as the elect. And so let us ferret out the lie. Let us seek the counsel of God as we seek to follow him in all things.